This accident I mentioned in the beginning was one of the several which had occurred during the presidency of Charles Mellon, when the New Haven Railroad was in critical financial condition. The railroad at that time owned or controlled almost the whole New England transportation system: railroads, trolley lines, and steamship companies. Mellon vacated his position under pressure and was succeeded by Howard Elliott. Howard Elliott was new on the job when this accident occurred, and one article read, "Such was the job that 53-year-old Howard Elliott faced in September 1913. In fact, his very first day had an incredibly tragic start when Elliott had to contend with one of the railroad's worst train accidents. It was an inexcusable tragedy. On board one of the first trains able to get around the wreck site, and standing on an open platform at the rear, was a stern and highly disturbed President Woodrow Wilson." As I mentioned earlier, that this was the second worst train wreck in Connecticut history. And the first one, I thought you'd be interested in, occurred 60 years earlier, in 1853, when an express from New York to New Haven went through an open drawbridge over the Norwalk River in South Norwalk with the loss of 45 lives. The growth of railroads in the United States reached its peak in the 1920s, when total route miles were over 250,000. It was during this period that the construction and modernization of the Cedar Hill freight yards was completed. The classification yards were said to be the largest in the United States and most likely in the world, and little old North Haven became the railroad hub of New England. Rail traffic from the west and the south reached Cedar Hill from two principal gateways: at Maybrook, New York, across the Hudson River, where we received cars from several railroads, and in metropolitan New York, where traffic from the Pennsylvania Railroad, Lehigh Valley, and the Central Railroad of New Jersey was received via car floats across New York Harbor, taken to Bay Ridge on Long Island and Oak Point in the Bronx. Although some trains from these gateways were moved right through to Boston, many were broken up at Cedar Hill and their cars sorted out for various destinations in New England. The classification process involved pushing cars from the receiving yards up to the humps, where they were uncoupled and dropped by gravity in cuts or blocks, depending upon destination, to the many destination tracks in the class yard. Switching the cars to their proper tracks and controlling their speed of descent by electric retarders was handled by control tower operators. And Lester Goodrich, who's a longtime member of our society, we hoped was going to be here. And he was one of these control tower operators and would certainly be able to answer any questions as to the details and complexity of switching these cars. Selection of the tracks that the cars were switched to was based on hump lists made from revenue waybills at the main yard office and teletyped to the towers. The speed of the cars was determined from weights on these lists. Outbound trains were made up by pulling specific blocks of cars out of the class yard into the departure yards. Switching of westbound and southbound cars received from local stations and from the gateways in the north, Springfield and Worcester gateways, were handled in the same manner. There were two major sections of the freight yards: the eastbound hump and the westbound hump. And it was a busy place. After the retarders were installed in 1929, it was possible to switch over 3,000 cars per day on each of the humps. Another major operation at Cedar Hill was the sorting of LCL freight at the LCL transfer. LCL was an acronym for less than carload freight, also known as merchandise, which consisted of small shipments contained in boxes, cartons, packages of all sizes and description. This freight was received in cars from all over the country and from local New Haven stations, and transferred from the inbound cars to regularly scheduled outbound cars, moved across the platforms by small motor trucks hauling small carts, or trailers as they call them. As many as 400 inbound cars could be handled daily. This was a lot of merchandise to be handled, and it was done very efficiently for the time. However, that became a thing of the past later on as truck transportation on the highways became such a competitive factor, and nothing remains up there or down there in Cedar Hill of the LCL transfers but grass growing through the remnants of the tracks. One of my first jobs on the railroad was called, if I remember correctly, Merchandise Schedule Supervisor. And I spent many days at the transfer analyzing the traffic flow for volume and destinations in order to make decisions on whether to add cars, establish new car schedules, or cancel certain destination car lines because of light volume. Then there was one other major operation at Cedar Hill, which was the operations at the creosoting plant. American Creosoting Company ran this operation, and ties and timbers were treated for preservation. Most of the creosoting plant facilities and tracks and the northbound departure yard areas are now occupied by a major shopping complex, including Home Depot, BJ's, and several merchandise chain stores. Cedar Hill yards are only a shadow of their former size. The primary reasons for the present minimal operations are the elimination of our western gateways when Conrail rerouted New England traffic through Selkirk Yard near Albany and over the old Boston and Albany division of the New York Central. This was also became a matter of facing the fact that the Poughkeepsie Bridge from Maybrook crossing the Hudson River burned. And although it's still standing, it never was used after that fire. The massive LCL operations, as I said, disappeared when the trucking industry became such a competitive factor. However, much of the small shipment business is still on the rails in containers and trailers, moved on specialized flat cars, and moved in what has been known as piggyback operations. I think that we can sum up my ramblings by saying that North Haven was truly a major railroad town and left its mark on railroad history. Any questions on Cedar Hill yard operations? Oh, I was going to ask Lester Goodrich to speak to that if he was here. But I will try to answer any other questions, and I note that we have a few other railroad employees, former railroad employees in the audience, who certainly can help me in that regard if there are any questions. And those of you who didn't have a chance to look at our displays, please look around. There are some interesting pictures of our old stations, and a large map of Cedar Hill yards in its heyday, some artifacts over in the corner, and a lot of paper material on the table there that might be of interest. And after you've had an opportunity to do that, we have some refreshments out in the other room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elliott. We appreciate it. If you have any questions, you can ask them formally or informally, however you'd like to do that. Are there any questions now? Anybody?
I don't think it's a question, but I remember my brother saying about the accident. He went over by bicycle to see it, and he said it was north of Parisi's, right?
Yeah, that's right.
North of where Parisi's
Yeah.
garage is.
It was at the power station there for trolley cars usually go there.
Mm-hmm.
It's right in that area.
Yeah. No, that takes it more than a mile north of the station, as the report read.
Yeah. But
I was hoping to get up to the state historical, or state library, and look up the actual reports of the Public Utilities Commission or the ICC, whatever, at that time, and maybe find a more specific location and any other information. I never got to it. Maybe one of these days I will.
You could look at one. I'll bring it to the next man's
You
breakfast.
have a record?
I have the report.
Oh, good.
It'll be at the next man's
I
breakfast.
mentioned railroad employees being present. I noticed we have David Peters. He's the Wallingford expert on railroads.
So to speak.
And there's Jim Finch from the New Haven. And see our engineer, Amos Hewitt Jr. And Charlie Dayton, who's in the accounting, budgetary departments. Am I missing anybody? Oh,
Larry Willard, formerly of the New Haven Register, a famous photographer and story writer, wrote a big article on the trains that you mentioned coming down. They call it, I think he called it Midnight Ghost or something.
yeah,
The white
ghost train.
The
Yeah.
ghost train.
White train or
Yeah,
ghost
white,
train.
that's right. Beautiful article.
Yeah. And then I did meet somebody else from Cedar Hill Yards. Frank Campaign. And perhaps if you have any questions about Cedar Hill Yards, you can talk to him.
And John Bradenity here too, an old timer. John Bradenity, old time railroad man.
Good to see you.
And Jack Williams.
That disaster in North Haven, that happened just about where Pratt & Whitney is now,
Is that right?
in that area.
Uh-huh.
And I remember it, I was 5 years old.
Do you? Very good. Very good. Another railroad employee?
There's a good book open in the library here in town, put up by the Connecticut Historical Night, up in Hartford, all about all the railroads that were
Yeah, I have a copy of that.
Connecticut.
It's a very good book, excellent book.
On that disaster, the cause of it, the way I understood it, was a bad fog.
Yeah. And the
There was no other
signals
train
of
front or
spirit.
anything.
I have one more thing to add to you had your little saying about the New Haven Railroad. When I went to work there, they called it the New Year, No Hope in Hungary.
Could you tell us anything about the employees? When was the union formed? I always heard they had a very strong union.
Well, that's very true. I don't have any specific information on that. I don't know if any...
I can give you one. The first railroad union was the Machinist Union. That was the first railroad union in the United States. And of course, in order to operate a railroad, you need a machinist. So every time you had a machinist, you had a union man. So that's when it started. And I want to give it about 1888, something like that. I have to look. I have it home. I was a former machinist and union man, but that's when they started. Then, of course, the brotherhoods came along. They had their beautiful charters, something like the Declaration of Independence. And they all, the Brotherhood of Local Engineers, the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, The fraternal orders were unbelievable. It was strictly a union operation.
And did they run the railroad YMCA on State Street?
No, the YMCA was a Christian organization. It was the Railroad Y. We've had a chance to stay there as families in Chicago and places like that. Now they're all pretty well just disappeared.
Yeah, that definitely was a mission, you might say, of the YMCA to take care of railroad people away from home.
What about the one that used to be down here on South Orange Street, down near the old market?
That was the old Y, the early Y. That was a former Haven and Derby Railroad station.
That was.
That was the former
That's where it
station.
started, right out through the
That was
hills.
the first Y.
We have a couple of newspapers that Lester has given us, and they are at the library and the display case in the front hall, in the lobby.
About what specifically, do you know?
I think they're maybe in the 50s, a newspaper and something about a union paper.
Mm-hmm.
Just two newspapers.
But, take a look.
Could you tell us what about the Broadway station now? Is it still there?
Yes, yes. It's still there, but there are no stops there anymore, as far as I know. When I first moved to North Haven in 1950, and I was working for the railroad, many days I got down the station, took a local passenger train to Hartford on some particular mission, and came back at night. There was a train each way that handled local passenger service.
How often did they run?
Hmm?
How often did they run?
Just a round trip a day. In other words, up in the morning and back at night.
Oh, just
Are there
one.
any stops in North Haven now?
Not
Any
that,
train stops? Are there any trains stopping in North Haven now?
not that I know of, no.
9th Street.
They tried it for a while over in Divine Street.
Yeah, they had a shelter over Divine Street down below Dixwell Avenue.
That hasn't been used in about 7 or 8 years.
Right.
It was an open platform. I remember my son used to get off there on the way up from Philadelphia when he was in.
Well, maybe it was open and when it first started. They did put a, I'm pretty sure they put a shelter up there.
Does anybody remember the mail catcher?
Sure.
The arm that swung out?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
It's just,
Tell us about it.
well, they used to put the mail into bags, tie the bags in the center so that they had the mail in both ends. And then with a piece of twine, they would tie the bottom to an arm and the top to an arm, and it would hang there like a figure 8. And they had a hook on the mail car that they would swing out, and it would catch the bag right in the center and break the twine and then pull it back into the mail car so that they had the mail picked up on the fly.
And the inbound mail was just thrown
Just
off.
thrown off.
Yeah, the bill over here, maybe you could point it out, is for lumber for a,
This is dated 1882, and it has to do with furnishing the railroad 4 mail cranes, and it lists various sizes of lumber. Please deliver at the railroad shops in New Haven at 35 cents per piece.
so they had mail catchers even then.
Oh, yeah. That was the period. And of course, at North Haven, the post office was right across the street, right across Broadway in building.
Right
still
back
there.
of your shoulder is a view.
Right.
This was the freight house, this was a post office, this was the gatekeepers, and right there is where the mail catcher was.
Yeah, this picture is of the railroad station. I guess from the looks of a car there, it wasn't dated, but it probably was in the early 30s. Then there's an older picture here of the same station.
This was with the canopy and without the canopy. That's when the change came, when they removed the canopy.
Mhm.
There was a weatherproof canopy you could get out of the weather. That was taken down. Very sad.
And then, as we're talking about stations, this is the old station going way back that was apparently a residence at first.
That was on the east side of the tracks.
And then we have a picture of the Clintonville station on the airline, which was right by the Clintonville crossing.
Which they later called Northford.
That was a Northford.
Yeah,
So that
it's
it
listed
wouldn't
as
get mixed up
Norfolk.
with Clinton and Clintonville.
The signs still reside. Last time I looked on that brick building out there on 22, on your right-hand side is a brick factory. Somebody had the Northford Station sign on that, and the other one was in the Northford Center. That was Chasley ran an antique shop, and he had one on there. I was always wanting to get it for my collection. I didn't have the courage to climb the brick building, and I never was able to get Chasley to part with the other one. So, I don't know where they ever went, but they're gone.
There's another picture here of Monowee Station, which was down by the Cedar Hill Freight Yards, down the end of Monowee's Avenue or...
And the picture of the wreck?
Yeah, the wreck I was talking about. This is one view of it. See, the engine was pretty well damaged. And it could have been a lot worse than it was.
Getting back to that wreck, I'll tie a thing up here, but there's two interesting facts on that wreck that people don't realize a lot. The lawyer in the case was Dr. Spock's father. And a young girl was returning from camp. She was from Ramsey, I believe Ramsey, New Jersey. Her name was Jean with an E, N-E-E, Annette. And her father was some particularly important person in New Jersey. She was terribly hurt. And Dr. Spock and the other lawyers got together and they told Mellon and the rest of the people that what they were going to do was offer her so much a day for the rest of her life. They were going to take care of her. She wasn't going to live the week out. That was in 14?
13.
13. In 1941, I have documents home where the trustees, this first or second set of trustees are arguing in 1941. She wrote to them wanting to know why they were trying to discontinue her payments. So this is 1941. She pulled them all, including Dr. Spock's father. That's a fact. I can prove that.
Yeah, Dr. Spock's father was general counsel at one time of the railroad.
Oh, they just met.
They're still having trouble with the plant down here, going back where the theaters are, for environmental troubles with something to do with the creosote.
The creosoting, pollution of the land.
Yep.
They used a lot of oil and the creosoting compounds that probably are in the dirt there still. Well, thank you very much for attending.
you.